Welcome to Almost Pro Bites, where we take a quick bite at the biggest conversations in sport. Today's topic is one that's becoming harder and harder to ignore: extreme heat. This week at the French Open, temperatures climbed into the low 30 degrees Celsius, and several players openly discussed how difficult the conditions were. One player even left the court in a wheelchair after suffering severe cramps following a 5-set match. And while heat has always been part of sport, the question we're asking today is, do sport heat policies need to change as temperatures rise?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic and such a relevant topic. We're not just talking about traditionally hot places anymore.
No.
When we think about extreme heat in sport, most people probably think of particularly a revolving tennis like the Australian Open. We've
Mm-hmm.
seen players struggle through that tournament on 40-degree days in Melbourne for years.
Mm-hmm.
But this conversation is now happening in Paris. And that's probably what caught my attention anyway to this topic, because if tournaments that historically haven't had to think too much about heat are suddenly dealing with it, I reckon that suggests that this isn't just an isolated issue.
That's so true. And I love that you mentioned the Australian Open, because it is the one that your mind immediately goes to, right? Like, it's hot and they're hot and they're out there a long time. But I think about cricket, as a sport generally, it's a
Yeah.
long time in really exposed conditions, and many, many other sports in different parts of the world. It's just typically Paris, and those aren't the traditional temperatures for May in Paris. So it has been an extraordinary tournament, and sport has always had this fascinating relationship with difficult conditions, where as spectators we celebrate the athletes who'll push through diversity, and we'll admire them if they can compete in the wind and the rain, and we can remember certain tournaments that we go, remember the conditions
Yeah.
they played in and got that victory or whatever it was. So in many ways, dealing with uncomfortable conditions is part of what separates the elite from everyone else, is it not?
Yeah, they often train for it.
They do train for it, that, and I think that's
Yeah.
what we kind of picture in these moments. But I wonder, anyone listening to this that might have an alternate position, is it potentially because we've created this mindset that says, well, sport's supposed to be hard at that level?
Yeah, I completely understand that perspective, because if you look like throughout sporting history, so my favorite topic, as we all know,
Yeah.
athletes have always had to adapt to whatever conditions they were given. Often it's integrated into part of the training as well. If they know they have a tournament in a certain, season or part of the world that's typically going to be hotter or colder. Tennis players play in scorching heat. Cyclists ride through mountains.
Mhm.
Marathon runners battle humidity. And like you mentioned, cricketers stand in fields for entire days. Um, I think, yeah, part of elite sport absolutely has always been managing conditions that aren't ideal. But I think there's a difference between uncomfortable and unsafe. And I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah.
where this is a relevant topic today.
Yeah, I agree. And that is the question. And the question is, where is the line, right? Where is the line between uncomfortable and unsafe? And is there something strange when we're watching that discomfort as a spectator and it crosses into unsafe and you stop? I know you sit at home and you can watch some of those transitions and think, I actually don't want to watch this anymore. You can see that
Yeah.
person's body is shifting, right? So I don't think we're disputing that heat can impact performance. I don't think anyone would dispute that. It's more about when it becomes a welfare issue that changes the complete nature of competitive challenge. It's something very different. And I don't think the line between what is uncomfortable and unsafe is always obvious. I think it gets to unsafe before people have probably realized it was there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a different line for everyone as well, because heat
Mhm.
affects people differently. So it's about creating a system or a rule that can protect everybody, because in heat one athlete may be able to cope reasonably well, while another could be experiencing all the signs of fatigue and dizziness and cramping and dehydration and other heat related illnesses. And unlike some environmental conditions, heat directly affects the body's ability to regulate itself.
Mhm.
Research has consistently shown that rising core body temperature can impair decision making, reaction time, concentration, and physical output. So
Mhm.
they're obviously all three important factors for athletes and their performance. So it's not just about comfort, it is about health and performance.
So real. But we know this, right? Because when our athletes cross into different seasons than the one that they've been training in, we send them early to acclimatize,
Yep, they'll
right?
rock up early, a week, couple of days, try and get
Right.
used to it, definitely,
Right.
yeah.
So we know that when the conditions are different from a temperature perspective, we know people take time to adjust. I think this is about the practical challenge about what sporting organizations can actually do. That is one thing that we think that we see sporting organizations do. They do this kind of early arrival to try and acclimatize. But stopping play sounds like a simple solution until you realize well, it's not. Until you realize what
Yeah.
wraps around the performance and entertainment of sport where there are broadcasting schedules and people have bought their tickets and athletes have trained really hard for this moment. They're likely to be the last person to say, "I want to stop," usually. So it is about someone having the safety trigger to be able to say no more at this point. But the truth is there's a lot more involved than simply saying it's hot. Let's try it for tomorrow.
Yeah, they're balancing, like, tournaments and, all of those people you mentioned, they're balancing so much, it's really
Mm,
a little bit like when sport becomes more than just the sport, isn't it? I mean, and this is where I think the conversation becomes so interesting because maybe the answer isn't stopping sport, like you said. Maybe it's, redesigning how sport is delivered. For example, we've already seen significant investment in stadium infrastructure around the world. The Australian Open now has multiple courts with retractable roofs. Wimbledon has centre court and court number one covered. Those investments weren't cheap, but they
mm.
fundamentally changed what tournaments do during extreme weather.
And they do, and I think, throwing money at solutions always gives you more options, does it not? But that raises a whole other questions, particularly in the framework of sport globally, and that is that if what we're saying is one of the solutions is covered stadiums, what happens when you can't afford them? What happens to the sport or the competitions
Mm.
that genuinely just don't have the money to throw a roof at a stadium? Because the reality is that elite sport often has resources that, let's say, community sport doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've just highlighted why this isn't just an elite athlete conversation. You know, in fact, I think community sport may be where the biggest challenge exists. A professional tennis player might have access to sports scientists, cooling strategies, hydration plans, and medical staff, whereas a 13-year-old playing a junior sport on a Saturday afternoon probably doesn't.
Mm,
A volunteer referee definitely doesn't. Parents sitting on the sidelines don't. We've all been there as parents and spectators.
yeah.
So when we talk about heat policies, we're actually talking about everyone
Yeah.
involved in sport,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
just elite players.
Agree, agree. And I think we have seen a bit of a move in this space. We've seen sporting organisations create responses to what to do with heat and heat conditions. We see heat policies that consider, temperature, but through to humidity and environmental conditions before deciding whether competition should continue. The question is whether the policies are appropriate or starting to get old, whether they were kind of a reaction a while ago to this discussion about heat. Um, and whether they're still relevant today, but I wonder whether it becomes a bigger conversation about the seasons we're playing different tournaments in.
Definitely. I actually also wonder whether or not scheduling becomes a bigger conversation moving forward. Scheduling, particularly tournament directing, is such a challenging role when you're trying to balance the athletes and the space and the time that you are allocated the space. Traditionally we schedule sport around convenience.
Mm,
Prime time television, weekend availability, and crowd attendance. But I actually think there's another question underneath this, which is, have we quietly normalized conditions in sport that we wouldn't accept elsewhere? And I think it's important to sit on that for a minute.
yeah.
You know, if if you think about, like, if a workplace asked people to perform physically in those conditions for hours, can you imagine? There would probably be conversations around breaks, hydration, modified conditions, and duty of care. There'd be people hitting up Fair Work, like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or just not
yeah,
showing
in
up. I'm not
sport.
coming in. I'm not coming in.
Yeah, exactly. Yet in sport, we often celebrate toughness. We praise athletes for pushing through. So
Yeah.
maybe the question isn't whether sport has become softer. Maybe the question is whether our expectations haven't evolved.
Which is interesting in itself, right? Because we are seeing more of a shift in this space. But the truth is, sport has always rewarded endurance. We've always loved the story of the player that pushed on through injury or backed up in a grand slam. They played 5 hours 2 nights ago, or whatever it is. Can they take another? The one that trains the hardest or stays on the field despite the circumstances. There's almost this unspoken badge of honor around sports suffering, and I think, to be fair, resilience
Yeah,
does matter because that is what sets elite athletes apart. There's something about heat that feels a bit different to me because eventually physiology has to win. You can't mental toughness your way out of heat illness, for want of a better term.
I wish you could though. Can you imagine?
I
Like
bet they would.
that'd be
I bet,
so
I bet
useful.
over in Paris, I bet they're wishing right now they could.
Yeah, doing everything they can to do exactly that. And this definitely, I don't think this is actually a conversation about comfort. Nobody is saying cancel sport because it's difficult.
Mm.
The main question here is at what point does challenge stop developing people and start exposing them? Because sport has already gone through this before with things like concussion protocol changes, and nobody would argue elite athletes today are less competitive because those standards improved.
No, no. And I mean, I think we'll get to a point where we'll probably find it hard to believe there weren't certain measures in place to avoid concussion, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
right now we're on the cusp of heading into that level of change. Well, I think that probably reframes this issue, though, that heat policies maybe aren't even about protecting athletes from hard conditions, but maybe about protecting integrity in competition. Because once conditions start to affect cognition and decision making and those basic physical functions, are we even still watching the best athlete win at that point? Or are we just watching whoever can tolerate an environmental stress the longest?
Oh, that's such a good question. Series of questions. Yeah, that is absolutely. Maybe the future question isn't how much heat should sport tolerate. Maybe it's what level of challenge actually allows athletes to perform at their best. Or is
Mm.
it or is competing in difficult conditions simply part of what sport has always been? I don't know. I don't have the answers. I'd like to hear what everyone else thinks.
Yeah.
Let us know what you think, with your opinions on this, and we'll catch you next time on Almost Pro Bites.